What are you doing here? My father's voice sliced through the wedding reception so sharply that every conversation around us died in an instant. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to people's lips. My sister froze in her white gown. Before I could answer, my father looked me up and down with open disgust. You always ruin everything. Leave. I almost turned around. Then the groom saw my face. The color drained from his skin. He leaned toward his father, a 4-star general, and whispered words that changed every life in that ballroom. Dad, that's her. The general stood up so suddenly his chair scraped across the marble floor. Every military guest instinctively looked toward him. Then, in complete silence, the general marched straight past my father, stopped in front of me, snapped to attention, and saluted. People often believe that the worst pain comes from strangers. They're wrong. The deepest wounds come from someone whose approval you've spent your entire life chasing. My name is Lauren Phillips, and for 38 years I believed that if I worked hard enough, served my country well enough, sacrificed enough birthdays, holidays, and pieces of my own life, one day my father would finally look at me the way he looked at my older sister. I was wrong. That Saturday morning, as I drove my black SUV through the familiar streets of my hometown in Virginia, I wasn't thinking about military operations, classified briefings, or the dozens of people waiting for my return on Monday morning. I was thinking about whether my father might smile when he saw me. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? A lieutenant colonel in the United States Army responsible for missions that carried consequences far beyond her own life, still hoping for something as simple as a father's smile. Yet there I was. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier. Emily Phillips and Daniel Carter request the honor of your presence. No handwritten note, no phone call, no message from my sister. Just a printed invitation as though I were another distant relative. I almost declined. In fact, I had written the email twice. But every time I imagined Emily looking around the room years later and realizing her younger sister hadn't come, I deleted it. Family deserved one more chance. At least that was what I kept telling myself. The church stood exactly as I remembered it, its white steeple cutting into a brilliant blue summer sky. Flower arrangements lined the stone walkway, and luxury cars filled the parking lot. I parked near the back. Old habit. Military people rarely looked for the closest parking space. As I stepped out, I straightened my navy blue dress. No medals, no ribbons, no rank insignia. No one looking at me would have guessed that less than 24 hours earlier, I'd been standing inside a secure operations center briefing officers twice my age. That was intentional. Today wasn't about the Army. Today was about Emily. Or at least I hoped it would be. The laughter drifting from the reception hall reached me before I opened the door. For one brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine walking inside, hugging my sister, maybe even hearing my father say, "I'm glad you came." Hope is a dangerous thing. The doors opened. My father spotted me almost immediately. His smile disappeared. He excused himself from a group of guests and walked toward me with long, impatient strides. I hadn't even reached the guest book. "What are you doing here?" His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Years of disappointment had taught him exactly how to hurt me without shouting. "I came for Emily. I don't remember inviting you. I received an invitation." A printed card doesn't mean you're welcome. Several nearby guests pretended not to listen. They all listened. I swallowed carefully. "I just wanted to congratulate her." He folded his arms. "You've embarrassed this family enough over the years." I stared at him. Embarrassed? I had spent nearly 2 decades serving this country. Missed birthdays because of deployments. Missed Christmas mornings. Missed Mom's knee surgery because I was halfway around the world. Embarrassed. Before I could respond, he continued. "You always choose the Army over your family." There it was. The accusation I'd heard since I was 19 years old. The day I'd accepted my commission. Emily had stayed close to home. Married young. Worked for a local real estate company. Hosted Thanksgiving dinners. Attended every birthday. She was the daughter everyone could see. I was the daughter who disappeared for months at a time without explanations. Neither of them ever asked why. They simply assumed they weren't important enough. If only they knew how many nights I sat alone overseas staring at photographs of home. "You could have called," I said quietly. I shouldn't have to call my own daughter. I did call. His expression hardened. "You called when it was convenient. Because I couldn't tell you where I was. Because my phone wasn't always allowed. Because sometimes people disappeared if missions failed. But none of those words could leave my mouth. So I remained silent. He mistook my silence for guilt. Emily doesn't need unnecessary drama today. I never intended to cause any. He took one step closer. Then leave. His words settled over me heavier than body armor ever had. Leave. Part of me wanted to argue. Another part wanted to remind him about the medals locked away in a cabinet he had never asked to see. Instead, I nodded once. Okay. I turned toward the door. Maybe he was right. Maybe my absence would make today easier. As I reached the entrance, an elegant woman in a pale blue dress intercepted me. You must be Lauren. Her voice carried warmth I'd forgotten strangers could have. I'm Margaret Carter, Daniel's mother. She extended both hands. I'm so happy you came. I blinked. Thank you. I've heard wonderful things about you. I almost laughed. Wonderful things. From whom? Certainly not from my family. Behind her, my father interrupted. Margaret, don't trouble yourself. She was just leaving. Mrs. Carter looked between us. No, she isn't. Her tone remained polite, but firm. She's family today. For reasons I couldn't explain, those 4 simple words tightened my throat. Family today? Not forever. Not always. Just today. Still, it was more kindness than I'd received from my own father in years. She guided me toward the reception hall. You'll sit with our guests. Oh, that's really not necessary. It absolutely is. My father looked ready to object again. Instead, he simply walked away, without another glance. I found my assigned chair near the back corner of the ballroom, far enough away that no one in my family had to acknowledge me, which honestly suited me fine. The ballroom sparkled beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. A string quartet rehearsed softly near the stage. White roses decorated every table. Guests laughed. Children chased one another between chairs. Life continued beautifully. I watched Emily from across the room. She looked radiant. Happy. I genuinely wanted this day to be perfect for her, even if I wasn't part of it. An elderly veteran sitting beside me noticed the small scar on my wrist. Army, he asked quietly. I smiled. Yes, sir. Retired Marine. We shook hands. No questions. No boasting. Just mutual understanding. Sometimes soldiers recognized one another without needing introductions. The wedding coordinator announced that the ceremony would begin in 5 minutes. Guests started taking their seats. Daniel stood near the altar adjusting his tie while greeting relatives. Then it happened. His eyes wandered across the room, past dozens of guests, past photographers, past the flowers, until they stopped on me. His smile vanished. His face turned ghostly white. For several long seconds he simply stared. Then he whispered something under his breath. He turned immediately toward the distinguished silver-haired man standing beside him, General William Carter. Daniel leaned close. The general frowned. What is it, son? Daniel never took his eyes off me. He whispered only 4 words. Dad, that's Colonel Phillips. For a heartbeat, General William Carter didn't react. He simply looked at his son with the quiet patience of a man who had spent 40 years commanding soldiers under pressure. His expression suggested that perhaps Daniel had mistaken someone else for Lauren. That happened more often than people imagined. Military careers were usually invisible to civilians, and even among service members, names were often more familiar than faces. What did you say? The general asked softly. Daniel swallowed. That's Colonel Phillips. The general slowly followed the direction of his son's gaze. His eyes landed on the woman sitting quietly near the back of the ballroom. A navy blue dress. Simple pearl earrings. No military insignia. No jewelry except a modest watch. No attempt whatsoever to draw attention. For nearly 3 seconds he simply stared. Then recognition flashed across his face. My God. He had not seen Lauren Phillips in almost 18 months. The last time had been inside a secure command facility, where every person in the room carried a clearance level few Americans would ever hear about. She had stood before senior officers twice her age, calmly presenting options during a crisis that threatened hundreds of American lives overseas. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't tried to impress anyone. She had simply solved the problem. General Carter still remembered what another 4-star had quietly said afterward. If every officer carried themselves like Colonel Phillips, I'd sleep better every night. Now she was sitting alone in the back corner of a wedding reception. Ignored. The quartet continued playing. Guests chatted. No one realized something extraordinary had just happened. General Carter adjusted the cuff of his jacket. Then he started walking. Robert Phillips noticed immediately. His entire posture changed. He straightened his tie, lifted his chin, and smiled proudly toward nearby relatives. I told you General Carter would come over, he whispered to one of Emily's uncles. Several family members nodded. After all, Robert had spent the last hour enthusiastically introducing himself to anyone wearing a military uniform. "My daughter's marrying into a wonderful family," he had proudly repeated. As the general approached, Robert stepped forward with his hand already extended. "General Carter," he said warmly, "it's an honor." The general never slowed. He walked directly past him. Robert's hand remained awkwardly suspended in mid-air. Confusion spread across his face. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. Where was the general going? Daniel followed several steps behind his father. His own heartbeat seemed louder than the music. He had spent 3 years under Lauren's command during joint operations early in his career. She had never shouted, never humiliated junior officers, never asked anyone to do something she wouldn't do herself. But she possessed a quiet authority that made everyone around her instinctively perform better. Young officers often whispered the same sentence whenever she entered a briefing room. "Pay attention, you'll learn something." Daniel had learned plenty, including the fact that Lauren despised public attention. He could already imagine how uncomfortable she felt right now. Lauren noticed them approaching only when their polished shoes entered her field of vision. She looked up. For the first time that afternoon, surprise appeared on her face. "General." Her voice remained calm, professional, warm without becoming familiar. General Carter stopped exactly 2 steps in front of her. Without hesitation, he drew himself to full military attention. Every instinct shaped by decades of service took over. His heels clicked together. His shoulders squared. His right hand rose sharply to his brow. The ballroom fell silent. Even the musicians stopped playing. Lauren's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "Sir," she stood immediately. Protocol mattered. Respect mattered. Although she wasn't wearing a uniform, she instinctively returned the salute. Every veteran present recognized the gesture. Several stood unconsciously themselves. Others simply stared. No civilian conversation could compete with the sight unfolding before them. General Carter lowered his hand. "It is an honor to see you again, Lieutenant Colonel Phillips." Lauren smiled gently. "The honor is mine, sir." "No," he replied quietly. "I insist." Around them, whispers spread from table to table. Did he salute her? "Who is she?" "She's military. I thought she was the bride's sister." Robert couldn't move. He looked from the general to Lauren and back again. Nothing made sense. His daughter. The daughter he'd just ordered to leave. Why was a 4-star general saluting her? Daniel stepped beside his father. His own voice remained respectful. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Lauren nodded. "It's good to see you again, Captain." Daniel smiled. "I was promoted to major last year." A trace of amusement crossed Lauren's face. "I stand corrected. Congratulations." "Thank you, ma'am." Robert stared at Daniel. You know my daughter." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "Sir." He hesitated. "I served under Colonel Phillips." Robert laughed nervously. "I think you've confused her with someone else." Daniel slowly shook his head. "No, sir." "There is no possibility of that." Lauren shifted slightly. "General, this really isn't necessary." He turned toward her. "With respect, Colonel, I disagree." His voice remained perfectly measured. "This young man standing beside me is alive because of decisions you made." Lauren's expression tightened. "Many people contributed. You always say that." "Because it's true. But someone still had to lead." The surrounding guests listened without breathing. Emily had stepped away from the bridal suite after hearing the sudden silence. Still wearing her wedding gown, she approached cautiously. "Dad!" No answer. "What's happening?" Robert simply pointed toward Lauren. I don't know." Emily looked toward Daniel. "Honey." Daniel reached for her hand. "I've been trying to tell you about the officer who mentored me years ago. The one you always called." His sentence faded. Emily slowly looked at Lauren. "No?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Lauren gave him an almost pleading glance. She clearly wished the conversation would end. She had never enjoyed discussing herself. General Carter recognized the expression immediately. He had seen it countless times after commendation ceremonies. She always tried to redirect praise toward everyone else. Some habits never changed. He decided to respect that. Instead of mentioning operations or classified accomplishments, he simply spoke from the heart. "There are officers who earn rank." He paused. "And there are officers who earn trust." He looked around the ballroom. "Lieutenant Colonel Phillips earned mine years ago." Silence. Complete silence. Robert felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. It wasn't embarrassment. Not yet. It was uncertainty. For decades, he had believed he understood his younger daughter. She joined the army, worked behind a desk, Disappeared for months, missed family gatherings, barely called. That was the story he'd repeated to neighbors, to relatives, even to himself. But suddenly, nothing fit anymore. He realized something uncomfortable. He had never once asked Lauren exactly what she did. Not once. General Carter turned toward the tables. "I apologize for interrupting your celebration." Then he looked back at Lauren. "I hope you'll allow an old soldier to say one more thing." Lauren gave a small nod. He smiled. "There are many officers with impressive resumes." His eyes softened. "But very few I'd willingly trust with my own son's life." He placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I trusted you with mine." Daniel lowered his head respectfully. "I still do." Across the ballroom, Robert's breathing became noticeably shallow. The room suddenly felt warmer. His palms were damp. His daughter, the daughter he'd dismissed less than 10 minutes earlier, was somehow receiving this level of respect from men whose entire lives revolved around military excellence. General Carter looked once more at Lauren. Then, with absolute sincerity, he said the sentence that echoed through every corner of the ballroom. "Without Lieutenant Colonel Phillips," he paused, "many families, including mine, might never have welcomed their loved ones home." No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time in his life, Robert Phillips looked at his younger daughter and realized he knew almost nothing about the woman standing before him. Silence lingered over the ballroom long after General Carter's words faded. No one reached for a champagne glass. No one resumed their conversations. Even the children who had been laughing only moments earlier seemed to sense that something important had happened. Lauren wished they would all simply sit down and continue celebrating Emily's wedding. This wasn't why she had come. She had driven nearly 4 hours hoping to quietly congratulate her sister, leave a gift, and disappear before dinner. Instead, every eye in the room rested on her. She hated being the center of attention. "General," Lauren said gently, "Emily deserves everyone's attention today." General Carter smiled with the kind understanding only years of command could teach. "You're right." He looked around the ballroom. But sometimes the truth arrives when no one expects it. Robert Phillips remained frozen. His thoughts refused to settle. For years he'd introduced Lauren to neighbors with the same sentence. "She works somewhere in the army." Somewhere. He had never bothered asking where, or why she disappeared for months, or why her phone sometimes stayed silent for weeks. His assumption had always been simple. If Lauren had accomplished anything extraordinary, surely someone would have told him. Surely she would have said something. Instead, she had always changed the subject. He had mistaken humility for mediocrity. Emily slowly approached her younger sister. For the first time that afternoon, there was uncertainty in her voice. "Lauren." Lauren turned toward her with a warm smile. "Congratulations." Emily blinked. That's all you want to say?" Lauren nodded. "It's your wedding day." Emily's eyes grew moist. After everything their father had said, after being humiliated in front of everyone, Lauren still hadn't mentioned herself once. That realization hurt more than anything Robert had heard. Daniel quietly stepped beside his bride. "There was a reason I never talked much about Colonel Phillips." Lauren sighed softly. "Daniel," he smiled apologetically. "I know. You don't like people making a fuss." She gave a tiny nod. "You remember." "I remember everything." Several guests leaned closer. Curiosity had completely replaced the awkwardness. One elderly man asked politely, "Major Carter, how do you know Colonel Phillips?" Daniel smiled. "I met her 12 years ago." His eyes drifted toward Lauren. "I was a brand new first lieutenant. I thought graduating near the top of my class meant I knew what leadership looked like." He laughed quietly. "I was wrong." Lauren looked almost embarrassed. "You learned quickly." "I had an excellent teacher." Robert listened carefully. His daughter. "Teaching officers. That didn't sound like paperwork." Daniel continued. "We were preparing for an overseas deployment. I was nervous. I tried to hide it." Lauren interrupted with a gentle smile. "You didn't hide it very well." Several guests chuckled. Daniel laughed too. "No, ma'am." "I suppose I didn't." He turned back toward the guests. "One night before we deployed, Colonel Phillips found me sitting alone outside headquarters. She didn't lecture me. She didn't tell me to toughen up. She simply sat beside me." Lauren looked down at the floor. She remembered that night. The young lieutenant had reminded her of herself years earlier. Terrified. Trying not to show it, Daniel continued. "She asked one question. Who are you worried about leaving behind?" I told her my parents. My younger sister. My grandmother. Lauren quietly finished the memory. "And then you cried." Daniel laughed again. "I absolutely did. So did half the officers before their first deployment. A ripple of warm laughter moved through the ballroom. The tension eased. General Carter folded his hands behind his back. Lauren understood something many commanders never learn. Fear isn't weakness. Pretending not to feel it is. Robert stared at Lauren. He had never imagined his quiet daughter comforting frightened young soldiers. At home she had rarely spoken. Not because she lacked confidence. Because no one had listened. General Carter glanced toward Robert. "May I tell them one story?" Lauren hesitated. "As long as you leave out operational details." "Of course." He nodded respectfully. "I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise." The guests listened carefully. "There was an operation several years ago." "Complicated." "Fast-moving." Communication was breaking down. "I was receiving reports from 3 different commands. None of them agreed." He smiled faintly. Everyone in the room had a different solution. He paused. "Except Lauren." She waited. She listened. And then she quietly asked one question. "Has anyone actually verified those reports?" He looked around the ballroom. No one had. The entire operation changed because she refused to make assumptions. He shrugged. "That decision saved lives." Lauren immediately shook her head. "It saved lives because hundreds of people did their jobs." General Carter smiled knowingly. "There she goes again." Daniel laughed. "She always says that." Lauren crossed her arms. "Because it's true." The general looked toward the guests. "You see, she has never taken personal credit." Not once. An elderly veteran sitting near Lauren finally spoke. "I've known officers like that." "They're rare." Lauren inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you for your service." The veteran smiled. "And thank you for yours." Robert suddenly remembered something. Years earlier, Lauren had come home wearing a sling after an injury. He had barely looked up from the television. "What happened?" "I got hurt during training." "You should have picked a safer job." That had been the entire conversation. He never asked whether she recovered. Never asked whether she needed anything. Never asked how serious it had been. The memory now struck him like a punch to the chest. What else had he ignored? General Carter reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Robert!" Robert looked up. The general removed his phone. "I normally don't show personal photographs. But perhaps today is different." He unlocked the screen, opened an old album, then turned the phone toward Robert. Robert took it with trembling hands. The photograph showed a military ceremony. Several senior officers stood together. In the center, Lauren, not hidden in the background, standing beside generals, confident, calm, respected. Another photograph. Lauren shaking hands with a cabinet official. Another. Lauren receiving a commendation. Another. Lauren standing beside Daniel years earlier, both smiling after what appeared to be a successful deployment. Robert's throat tightened. "When?" His voice cracked. "When were these taken?" "Over the last decade," the general answered quietly. "There are many more." Robert stared at the screen. 10 years. 10 years of achievements. 10 years he knew nothing about. Not because Lauren had hidden them. Because he had never cared enough to ask. Emily slowly stepped closer to look at the photographs. Tears formed in her eyes. I didn't know." Lauren smiled softly. "You weren't supposed to." Emily looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I never wanted my job to become the center of family conversations." "So you just—" Lauren shrugged. "I went to work." General Carter nodded. "Exactly." Daniel smiled. "That's why people respect her. Not because of her rank. Because she never needed anyone to notice." Robert lowered the phone. His hands were shaking visibly now. Memories flooded his mind. Every birthday Lauren had missed. Every Thanksgiving he accused her of abandoning the family. Every Christmas gift she mailed instead of delivering herself. He had interpreted each absence as rejection. He had never considered another possibility. Perhaps she had been somewhere she simply couldn't talk about. Perhaps she had been protecting families like his. Lauren noticed her father's expression. She recognized it immediately. Confusion. Regret. Questions he should have asked years ago. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because another memory surfaced. She was 21. Graduating from officer candidate school. She had mailed her father the ceremony information. He never came. Later he had said, "I was busy helping Emily move." She had quietly accepted it, just as she had accepted so many disappointments. Robert looked at his daughter. For the first time in decades, he wasn't seeing the little girl who left home. He was seeing a woman whose life had unfolded almost entirely without him. And the realization broke something deep inside him. Robert Phillips stood motionless, still holding General Carter's phone, as though it weighed far more than a few ounces. The photographs no longer looked like isolated moments. Together they formed an entire life, a life his youngest daughter had lived, while he remained convinced she had simply drifted away from her family. The wedding coordinator quietly asked the quartet to pause for a few more minutes. No one objected. The guests weren't waiting for music anymore. They were waiting to understand. General Carter gently took his phone back and slipped it into his jacket. "I hope you don't mind," he said to Lauren. She offered a faint smile. "I've stopped trying to control what people know about me. Life usually decides that for me." Her answer drew a quiet laugh from Daniel. "That sounds exactly like you." Lauren looked at him. "You've become more talkative since I knew you." "My wife says the same thing." Emily managed a weak smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Since childhood, she had always believed she knew her younger sister. Lauren had been the quiet one, the dependable one, the sister who mailed thoughtful birthday presents when she couldn't come home, the sister who never complained even when family gatherings ended without her. Emily suddenly realized something painful. She couldn't remember ever asking Lauren what her work actually involved. She had accepted the easiest explanation that Lauren simply loved the army more than her family. Now that explanation was falling apart. Robert cleared his throat. His voice sounded strangely fragile. "Lauren?" She turned toward him. "Yes. He hesitated, searching for words that refused to come. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Lauren answered almost immediately. "I tried." Robert frowned. "When?" "A lot of times." Silence settled again. Lauren didn't speak with anger. She spoke with the calm honesty of someone who had replayed these memories many times. "The first year after I became an officer, I called home almost every Sunday." Robert stared at her. "You remember those calls?" "I remember waiting." She smiled sadly. "Most of them lasted less than 5 minutes." Robert searched his memory. The memories came slowly. Phone calls while he watched football. Conversations interrupted because neighbors stopped by. Times he had handed the phone to Emily because she had more interesting things to say. Lauren continued quietly. "I used to tell you about training. You'd say, 'That's nice,' and ask whether Emily had found a new apartment." Robert lowered his eyes. She wasn't accusing him. She was simply describing what had happened. And somehow that hurt even more. General Carter remained respectfully silent. This was no longer about military service. This was about a father and daughter. Lauren folded her hands in front of her. "Do you remember Grandpa's funeral?" Robert looked up. "Of course." "I wasn't there." His expression hardened with old disappointment. "No." "You weren't?" Lauren nodded. "I know." A long pause followed. Then she quietly added, "I landed at Andrews Air Force Base 3 hours after the funeral ended." Robert blinked. "I thought—" "You thought I chose not to come." She smiled faintly. "I wanted to." I begged. "I even asked if someone else could replace me." Her voice remained steady, though her eyes softened with old sorrow. "They said no?" General Carter spoke for the first time in several minutes. "I remember that week." Lauren looked at him surprised. "You do?" He nodded. "You never complained. You simply asked whether your family had everything they needed." Robert slowly turned toward the general. "You knew—" "I knew she wanted to attend. There were circumstances beyond anyone's control. I can't discuss them, but I remember how disappointed she was." Robert closed his eyes. For 15 years, he had carried quiet resentment toward his daughter because she had missed her grandfather's funeral. She had carried quiet guilt for the same reason. Neither of them had known the other's truth. Emily stepped closer until she stood beside Lauren. "I always thought—" She stopped. Lauren waited patiently. "I thought you didn't love us enough." Lauren looked genuinely surprised. "I loved you too much." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Lauren looked across the ballroom toward the large windows overlooking the gardens. "I never wanted you worrying about me. If I told you where I was, if I told you what I was doing, you'd spend every day wondering whether I'd come home. So I talked about ordinary things. The weather. Restaurants. Books. I figured that was kinder." Emily covered her mouth. Tears rolled down her cheeks. For years, she had mistaken emotional protection for emotional distance. Daniel quietly squeezed his wife's hand. "I used to wonder why Colonel Phillips never talked about herself." He smiled. "Eventually I realized something. When someone has truly done extraordinary things, they usually don't need to tell everyone." Several veterans in the room nodded in agreement. An elderly woman sitting near the front spoke softly. My late husband was the same. He came home from Vietnam. Never talked about medals, only asked how the children were doing. General Carter smiled respectfully. Many of the finest soldiers I've known behaved exactly that way. Robert slowly approached Lauren. Only a few steps separated them now. Yet those few steps felt heavier than the previous 20 years. I owe you an apology. Lauren looked into his eyes. For what? His voice cracked. For believing the worst about you. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied his face. She noticed something unfamiliar. Her father looked older than she remembered. Not physically, emotionally. The certainty that had always defined him had disappeared. In its place stood a man confronting decades of mistaken assumptions. You weren't entirely wrong, Lauren said softly. Robert looked confused. I did miss birthdays. I missed Christmas. I missed anniversaries. I wasn't here. But I never stopped wishing I could be. Robert's eyes filled with tears. I thought you stopped choosing us. Lauren slowly shook her head. I never had that choice. The sentence struck him harder than any accusation ever could. He remembered every family gathering where he had criticized her absence, every sarcastic comment, every disappointed sigh. Not once had he considered that Lauren herself might have been heartbroken each time she couldn't come home. General Carter looked toward Robert. May I tell you something? Robert nodded. There were several occasions when Lauren voluntarily postponed promotions. Robert frowned. Why? Because accepting them immediately would have required leaving soldiers who still needed her. Lauren smiled awkwardly. It wasn't that dramatic. Daniel laughed quietly. Ma'am. It was. General Carter nodded. Leadership isn't measured by how many people salute you. It's measured by how many people trust you. He glanced toward Lauren. Your daughter earned that trust, Robert whispered almost to himself. And I never even knew. Lauren noticed something she hadn't seen since childhood. Her father couldn't look her directly in the eyes anymore. Not because he was angry, because he was ashamed. For years, Lauren had imagined this moment. She thought it would feel satisfying, victorious. Instead, it felt strangely sad. Nothing could return the birthdays. Nothing could recreate conversations that never happened. Nothing could give them back the years they had lost. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast warm golden light through the ballroom windows. The wedding planner quietly asked whether the ceremony should continue. Emily looked at Lauren, then at her father, then back again. No, she whispered. Not yet. She walked toward her younger sister until they stood face to face. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Emily wrapped both arms around Lauren. The embrace was hesitant at first, then tight, very tight. Lauren closed her eyes. Slowly, she hugged her sister back. Across the room, Robert watched his daughters holding each other. A realization settled over him with painful clarity. For 20 years, Lauren had never stopped trying to belong. She had simply grown tired of knocking on a door that never opened. And for the first time in his life, Robert understood that the distance between them had never been measured in miles. It had been measured in everything he had failed to see. The ceremony finally began nearly 40 minutes later. No one complained about the delay. Some weddings are remembered because of the flowers, others because of the food. Emily and Daniel's wedding would be remembered because every person in that ballroom had witnessed something far more powerful than a perfect ceremony. They had watched a family begin to tell the truth. Lauren stood near the back as Emily walked down the aisle. She had quietly insisted on giving her seat to an elderly guest, and slipped into a corner where she hoped no one would notice her again. That hope lasted less than a minute. When the minister asked who was presenting the rings, Daniel unexpectedly looked toward Lauren. Before we continue, he said gently, I'd like to ask someone to come forward. Lauren immediately shook her head. Daniel smiled. I promise this won't embarrass you. The guests laughed softly. Reluctantly, Lauren walked to the front. Daniel reached into his pocket and removed a small velvet box. It isn't for me, he said. It's something I've carried for years. Inside lay a simple challenge coin. Its edges were worn smooth from being carried through deployments and training exercises. I received this from you after my first overseas assignment. Lauren recognized it immediately. She had forgotten she had ever given it to him. I was terrified, Daniel admitted. You told me something I've never forgotten. He looked at the coin before speaking. Leadership isn't about being the strongest person in the room. It's about making everyone else believe they're stronger than they think they are. He smiled. I've tried to live by those words ever since. Lauren's eyes glistened. I don't even remember saying that. You probably don't, Daniel laughed. You changed people's lives so often that moments like this became ordinary to you. The minister waited patiently while the applause slowly faded. Then the wedding proceeded without another interruption. For the first time that afternoon, Lauren was simply another guest. She preferred it that way. The reception felt different after the ceremony. People no longer whispered about Lauren. Instead, they approached her one by one, not to ask about medals, not to ask about classified missions. They spoke about sons serving overseas, granddaughters entering military academies, husbands who had worn uniforms decades earlier. Lauren listened far more than she spoke. That General Carter noticed had always been her greatest strength. Late in the evening, after the music had begun and the younger guests filled the dance floor, Robert found Lauren standing alone on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The summer air carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. Neither of them spoke immediately. Robert stood beside her, resting his hands on the stone railing. When you were little, he finally said, "You used to bring me dandelions." Lauren smiled faintly. I remember. I always told you they were weeds. You did. I thought I was teaching you something. He laughed bitterly. The truth is, you were trying to give me the best thing you could find. Lauren remained quiet. Robert turned toward her. I spent years believing respect had to be earned. His voice trembled. I forgot that love isn't supposed to work that way. Lauren looked at the stars beginning to appear above the trees. I kept hoping one day you'd ask me about my life. Robert nodded slowly. I know. I should have. You don't owe me stories about the army. She looked at him in surprise. I don't. No, he shook his head. What I missed wasn't your career. He swallowed hard. I missed my daughter. Lauren felt something inside her soften, not disappear. Years of hurt could not vanish in one conversation. But it shifted, like ice beginning to melt. Robert reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. I have something. He unfolded a yellowed envelope. I found this in the attic last month. Lauren immediately recognized her own handwriting. She had mailed it home almost 18 years earlier. It was the letter she wrote during officer candidate school after her commissioning ceremony. I never opened it, Robert admitted. I don't know why. I was stubborn. Lauren slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of a 21-year-old Lauren wearing a brand new army dress uniform. Across the bottom she had written, I hope you'll be proud of me someday. Her breathing caught. She had forgotten those words. Robert had not. I've read them 100 times over the past month, he whispered. I was too late. Lauren folded the letter carefully. No. He looked confused. It's never too late to tell the truth. Tears finally escaped Robert's eyes. I am proud of you. The words were simple, quiet, late, but they were real. Lauren closed the distance between them and embraced her father. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Some wounds heal through conversation. Others heal through silence. The following Monday morning, Lauren returned to Fort Belvoir before sunrise. The base looked exactly as she had left it. Soldiers hurried between buildings carrying coffee cups. A flag rose slowly into the morning sky. Everything felt familiar. Her executive officer met her outside headquarters. Good weekend, ma'am. Lauren looked toward the flag. It was... She paused. Unexpected. As she entered her office, she noticed a small package waiting on her desk. There was no return address. Inside rested the faded challenge coin Daniel had shown at the wedding. Beneath it lay a handwritten note. Real leaders never know how many lives they change. Thank you for changing ours. She smiled, then placed the coin beside a framed family photograph that now meant something different. Not because her family had suddenly become perfect. They hadn't. Healing wasn't a single conversation. It was a decision made again and again. Weeks later, Robert visited the base for the first time. He didn't come to see a lieutenant colonel. He came to have lunch with his daughter. When Lauren walked across the courtyard in uniform, dozens of soldiers greeted her respectfully. Robert watched quietly, not with surprise anymore, not with disbelief, only with gratitude that he had been given another chance to know the remarkable woman she had become. As they walked toward the dining hall together, he didn't ask about medals. He didn't ask about promotions. Instead, he smiled and asked the question Lauren had waited decades to hear. So, how have you been? Lauren laughed through happy tears. I've been waiting a long time to answer that. Sometimes the greatest honor isn't a salute from a general. Sometimes it's hearing the words you needed from the person who should have said them years ago. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever waited years for someone to finally see you for who you really are? Share your story in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas like this one, please subscribe and join us for more stories that remind us hope and reconciliation are always worth fighting for.